Hi, I'm Tiffany Jackson here at Los Angeles Trade Tech College, and I'm going to be going over some basic pattern making skills with you. First, I'm going to show you how to walk a basic block. I have a basic block here that's a size 10. This particular block has seam allowance on it. Sometimes you're working with blocks that have seam allowance and sometimes you don't. How do you know the difference? If you have notches indicating where the seam allowance goes, that tells you that this pattern has seam allowance. This is another block. This particular block does not have seam allowance. How do I know the difference? I am looking for the pieces or the seams that are going to stitch together. On this shoulder, there is no notch here indicating that there's any seam allowance added because there's no 1/2 inch notch here, and then the same thing at the side seam. I don't have a notch as I do on this that's telling me that there's seam allowance on this pattern. So you want to be very careful when you're working, because whenever you're walking a pattern, you have to walk the pattern on the stitch line. When walking the basic pattern, one of the easiest things to do is to indicate where the stitch line is. So at the shoulder seam, I've drawn a dotted line here that's telling me that that's where the stitch line is. I'm going to be walking the shoulders together. I'm going to be walking the front shoulder to the back shoulder. I'm going to be walking it along the stitch line. So you can either use a pencil or you can use a push pin, and you want to maneuver this so that your push pin or pencil is walking right along the stitch line. So I'm moving this, I'm walking it to the notch, and this is working because I end up notch on top of notch. Now, there is something going on here, because if you notice, these shoulders are not the same length. They're not the same length because the back shoulder has a dart. So when we're walking the pattern, we have to move the pattern as if the dart is closed. Because if we were joining these two seams, the dart would be sewn first and then the seam would be joined. So when we're walking end to end, let me start again, we're walking notch on top of notch, and I'm walking to this notch, and then I'm moving this as if the dart is closed, and I continue to walk the rest of the way. I want to make sure that these two stitch lines are the same length. Same thing with the side seam. We have a bust dart. So again, if I line these up together, there's no way they're going to match. This is going to be longer because there's a bust dart. When walking the side seam, we're going to do the same thing. I've indicated 1/2 inch seam allowance here. I'm going to put notch on top of notch. I'm using my push pin and I'm walking along the stitch line, and I want to make sure that these notches line up. One should be exactly on top of the other. And then I'm going to shift my pattern so that this notch is on top of this notch, and I'm going to continue walking the pattern down. And what I'm looking for is to make sure, again, the stitch lines are the same length. You are only walking the seams that sew together. I'm not walking the armholes because the front armhole and back armhole aren't related. They don't walk together. I'm not walking the bottom. Again, the front and the back don't sew together. They're not related. And I'm not walking the center front to the center back because, again, the center front and center back don't sew together. I'm only walking the areas that sew together. And you want to make sure all of your notches line up, and you want to make sure that your stitch lengths are exactly the same. And that's how to walk a basic block.